What would you do if the people meant to protect you became your worst nightmare? When Shaquille O'Neal found himself stopped on a dark, empty road, he had no idea his life was about to take a shocking turn. Watch until the end to uncover a story of courage, justice, and an unforgettable fight for what's right. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire change. Shaquille O'Neal was driving down a deserted road in his sleek new SUV. The night was calm, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness as he hummed along to the music playing softly on the radio. He had just wrapped up a charity event in a nearby town and was looking forward to getting home for some rest. The tranquility of the drive was interrupted by flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. A police car appeared out of nowhere, its siren blaring. Shaq sighed and pulled over to the side of the road, puzzled about why he was being stopped. Two white officers exited the patrol car. The older one, a tall, burly man with a square jaw, strutted toward Shaq's window. His name tag read Sergeant Barkley. Behind him was a younger officer, lean and awkward, with Miller stitched onto his uniform. Barkley leaned down, peering into the car with a smirk. "Well, well," Barkley drawled, "what do we have here? Big guy in a big shiny car. Tell me, pal, where'd you steal this from?" Shaq kept his composure, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. "This is my car, officers. Can I help you with something?" Barkley chuckled darkly. "Your car, huh? Guys like you don't usually drive something this nice unless you've been up to no good. Step out of the vehicle." Before Shaq could respond, Officer Miller stepped forward, his face lighting up with recognition. "Wait a second. You're Shaquille O'Neal, aren't you? Man, I used to watch your games all the time. You were amazing." Shaq nodded politely. "That's me. I appreciate the support." Barkley cut Miller off with a sharp glare. "Enough of that, Miller. Don't let the fame fool you. He's just another one of them who think the rules don't apply." Turning back to Shaq, Barkley barked, "I said, step out of the car, now." Shaq sighed and opened the door, stepping out of the SUV. His towering frame loomed over the two officers, but he kept his demeanor calm and non-threatening. Barkley's smirk deepened as he looked him up and down. "What are you, 7 feet tall? Guess that makes it easier for you to reach into windows and snatch things that don't belong to you." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He handed over his license and registration, hoping to de-escalate the situation. Barkley snatched the documents out of his hand and studied them with exaggerated slowness. "Looks legit," he muttered, "but you know how good these forgeries are getting these days." Miller hesitated, glancing nervously between Barkley and Shaq. "Sarge, maybe we should just run the plates and let him go. I mean, it's Shaq." Barkley rounded on him. "You listen to me, Miller. I don't care who he is. Guys like him always think they're above the law. It's our job to remind them they're not." Barkley walked around the SUV, his flashlight beaming through the windows. "Nice car. Too nice for someone like you. What's the matter? Couldn't settle for a basketball. Had to take a rich man's ride instead?" Shaq stayed silent, his patience wearing thin. Barkley's flashlight found a gym bag in the back seat. "What's in there? Stolen goods, drugs, guns?" He motioned for Shaq to open it, but before he could, Barkley laughed. "Never mind. I bet it's just your ego taking up all the space." As this unfolded, a shadowy figure crouched in the bushes nearby. It was a teenage boy, Marquez, who had been running along the road as part of his training for a track meet. He'd seen the police car pull Shaq over and instinctively hidden in the shadows. Now, with his phone in hand, he recorded the entire exchange, his heart pounding with fear and anger. Barkley finally tossed Shaq's documents back at him. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood tonight. But you know what? I think you need a little reminder of who's in charge here." He pulled out a lighter and flicked it open, holding the flame close to the car. "How would you feel if this shiny ride of yours went up in smoke?" "Officer, this is unnecessary," Shaq said firmly, but Barkley just laughed. Without warning, Barkley lit a piece of cloth from his pocket and tossed it onto the hood of the SUV. Flames began to lick at the paint. Barkley and Miller stepped back, watching with smirks as the fire spread. "Guess you'll be walking home tonight, big guy," Barkley sneered. Shaq stood frozen, his fists clenched as his car burned before him. Miller, looking visibly uncomfortable, muttered, "Sarge, don't you think this is going too far?" "Shut up, Miller," Barkley snapped. "Get in the car. We're done here." As the patrol car sped off, Marchese emerged from the shadows and approached Shaq cautiously. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, holding up his phone, I recorded everything. I think this could help." Shaq looked at the boy, his anger giving way to gratitude. "Thank you, kid. You just did something very important." He put a reassuring hand on Marchese's shoulder. "But now we need to make sure this gets out." As the fire consumed the SUV, Shaq and Marchese stood together, illuminated by the flames, united by a shared determination to fight back. Marchese handed his phone to Shaquille, his hands trembling as he replayed the video. The clear footage showed everything: the smirks, the racist remarks, and finally, the moment Sergeant Barkley lit the SUV on fire. Shaquille placed a reassuring hand on Marchese's shoulder, thanking him for his bravery. "You did the right thing, kid," Shaq said. "But now we have to make sure this gets seen by the right people." Marchese nodded, his determination matching the fire in Shaq's eyes. The next morning, Shaquille arrived at the local police station to file a formal complaint. He walked in, his towering frame commanding attention, but the officers behind the desk barely looked up. When he explained what had happened the night before, the officer in charge, a gray-haired man with a dismissive tone, raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you're not exaggerating? Maybe you misunderstood the situation. Our officers don't just set cars on fire." Shaq felt his frustration rising but kept his voice calm. "I have video evidence. Everything they said and did is on tape." The officer sighed and reluctantly agreed to take Shaq's statement, but it was clear he wasn't taking it seriously. "We'll look into it," he said, his tone making it obvious that nothing would come of it. As Shaq left the station, he overheard another officer mutter, "Big guy thinks he can throw his weight around just because he's famous." Disappointed but not deterred, Shaq knew he needed to take a different approach. He contacted a friend from his basketball days who now worked as a journalist. When Shaq described the incident, the journalist was shocked but cautious. "This is serious, Shaq. If you're ready to go public with this, it's going to be a fight. Are you sure you want to take that on?" Shaquille's response was resolute. "They burned my car and tried to humiliate me. This isn't just about me. It's about stopping them from doing this to someone else." That evening, Shaq uploaded the video to his social media accounts with a detailed explanation of what had happened. Within hours, the video went viral. Comments poured in, with people expressing outrage and calling for justice. National news outlets picked up the story, and hashtags like #JusticeForShaq and #StopPoliceRacism began trending. Marchese's footage became the centerpiece of the narrative, showing the undeniable proof of the officer's actions. The reaction wasn't entirely supportive. While many rallied behind Shaq, others accused him of exaggerating the situation, or trying to ruin the careers of hard-working officers. Local officials faced mounting pressure to respond, and within a day, the police department announced that Sergeant Barkley and Officer Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Meanwhile, Marchese found himself in the spotlight as well. Shaq made sure to protect the boy's identity, but reporters still managed to track him down. Marchese was scared at first, unsure if speaking out would make him a target, but Shaq reassured him, "You're not alone in this. I've got your back." Together, they appeared in a brief interview, with Marchese describing what he had witnessed. His quiet courage and clear account of the events added even more weight to the growing public outcry. As the days passed, support for Shaq grew. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering their resources and expertise. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs demanding justice and reform. Shaq, who had always been a private person, found himself at the forefront of a movement. Though he never sought to be a leader in this fight, he embraced the role, knowing it was bigger than him. Despite the growing support, Shaq faced resistance at every turn. The police department tried to discredit the video, claiming it was taken out of context. They argued that the officer's actions were a misunderstanding and that there was no evidence of malicious intent. It was a frustrating reminder of how deeply ingrained the system's biases were. But Shaq refused to back down. He worked tirelessly with his lawyer, his journalist friend, and the activists who had joined the cause to keep the pressure on. Marchese, despite his initial fears, became an unexpected symbol of bravery. At just 16, he stood in front of cameras and crowds, speaking about the importance of standing up to injustice. "I recorded that video because I knew what they were doing was wrong," he said in one interview. "If we don't speak up, who will?" As the momentum built, Shaq knew the battle was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. The video had sparked a fire, one that couldn't be extinguished, and Shaq was ready to see it through to the end. The backlash against Sergeant Barkley and Officer Miller intensified as the video continued to spread, drawing the attention of national news outlets and social media influencers. Protests erupted outside the police department, with people demanding accountability not only for the two officers, but also for the systemic racism that allowed such behavior to thrive. Shaquille O'Neal found himself at the center of the growing movement, his face and name becoming symbols of resistance and justice. Despite the overwhelming public support, the fight was far from easy. Behind the scenes, Shaq and his team faced constant obstacles. The police department issued a statement claiming the video lacked context and that the officers were simply following protocol during a routine traffic stop. They suggested that Shaq's fame was being used to blow the situation out of proportion, a claim that enraged both Shaq and his supporters. Determined to expose the truth, Shaq doubled down, working closely with his lawyer and a team of civil rights activists to gather more evidence. Marchese's video was strong, but it wasn't enough on its own to counter the narrative the police department was trying to spin. Shaq's lawyer began digging into Barkley's and Miller's records, uncovering a pattern of complaints against Barkley for excessive force and racial profiling. The department had quietly dismissed these complaints in the past, but now, with public attention focused on the case, these incidents were coming to light. The revelations further fueled the protests, and calls for a deeper investigation grew louder. Officer Miller, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. Unlike Barkley, who remained defiant and unapologetic, Miller struggled with guilt over his actions that night. He hadn't wanted to participate in the harassment, but he'd been too afraid to stand up to Barkley. Now, with his name plastered across headlines and his family receiving threats, Miller began to question everything. One night, he reached out to Shaq's lawyer anonymously, offering to share his side of the story in exchange for protection. Miller revealed that Barkley had a long history of bullying his colleagues and frequently made racist remarks during patrols. "I didn't agree with what he did," Miller confessed, "but I didn't stop him either. And for that, I'm just as guilty." Miller's decision to come forward was a turning point in the case. His testimony, combined with the video evidence and Barkley's history of misconduct, created a damning case against the sergeant. When the police department realized they couldn't contain the situation any longer, they announced that Barkley and Miller would face formal charges, including destruction of property, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. While many celebrated the progress, others criticized the department for dragging its feet and only acting under public pressure. Shaq remained focused, refusing to let the momentum die down. He continued to speak at rallies and meet with activists, using his platform to shine a light on the broader issue of systemic racism in law enforcement. He also kept close contact with Marchese, ensuring the young boy's safety and helping him navigate the sudden media attention. Shaq saw a spark in Marchese, a determination that reminded him of his own youth, and he became a mentor to the boy, encouraging him to stay strong and keep speaking the truth. As the date for the trial approached, tensions continued to rise. Barkley, true to his nature, maintained his innocence and tried to paint himself as a victim of a media witch hunt. His legal team attempted to discredit Marchese's video, arguing that it didn't capture the full scope of the interaction. But with public sentiment firmly against him and Miller prepared to testify, Barkley's defense grew weaker by the day. Through it all, Shaq never lost sight of what was at stake. This wasn't just about justice for himself or punishing two bad cops. It was about setting a precedent, about showing people that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged and changed. "This fight isn't just mine," Shaq said during an interview. "It's for everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter. We all matter, and it's time the world sees that." The trial promised to be a defining moment, not just for Shaq, but for the entire movement. As he prepared to take the stand and tell his story, he knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. But he also knew that the fire ignited that night on the road was now burning brighter than ever, fueled by hope, determination, and an unwavering belief in justice. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists, activists, and community members filled the seats, eager to witness what many were calling a landmark case against police misconduct. Shaquille O'Neal entered the room with quiet determination, his towering presence commanding respect. Marchese walked beside him, his small frame almost dwarfed by Shaq's, but his expression showed the same resolve. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table, ready to face Sergeant Barkley and Officer Miller, who sat across the room with their legal team. Barkley maintained a smug expression, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, while Miller looked down, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The prosecution began by presenting the video recorded by Marchese. The footage played on a large screen, and the courtroom fell silent as Barkley's voice echoed through the room, dripping with disdain and mockery. His racist remarks, the threats, and the final act of setting the SUV on fire were all captured with crystal clarity. Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience as the video ended, and Barkley shifted uncomfortably in his seat for the first time. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This video is not just evidence of one man's abuse of power," she said. "It is a window into a systemic problem that has gone unchecked for far too long." Shaq was called to the stand to testify. He recounted the events of that night with a calm but firm voice, describing how Barkley's words and actions escalated from insults to outright criminal behavior. "I've faced discrimination before," Shaq said, his deep voice resonating through the room. "But this was different. This was hatred and abuse of power on a level that could have cost someone their life. I don't want to see anyone else go through what I did." His testimony was met with nods of agreement from many in the audience, and even the judge seemed moved by his words. When Marquez was called to testify, the young boy's voice wavered at first, but Shaq's encouraging nod from the plaintiff's table gave him strength. Marquez described what he had witnessed that night, emphasizing how terrified he felt watching the events unfold. "I knew it wasn't right," he said, his voice steadying. "I didn't know if they'd hurt him, but I knew I had to do something. So I filmed it because I wanted people to see the truth." His bravery drew admiration from the audience, and even the defense struggled to challenge his account. The turning point came when Officer Miller took the stand. Initially reluctant, Miller's testimony was riddled with hesitation, but as he spoke, it became clear that he was struggling with guilt. "I didn't agree with what Sergeant Barkley did," Miller said, his voice breaking. "But I didn't stop him either. I was scared of losing my job, scared of what he might do to me if I stood up to him, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Miller went on to describe Barkley's pattern of abusive behavior, revealing how the sergeant had bullied both civilians and colleagues for years. His testimony was a damning indictment of Barkley and added weight to the prosecution's case. Barkley, however, remained defiant. When he took the stand, he dismissed his actions as a misunderstanding and accused Shaq of overreacting. "I did what I thought was necessary to maintain order," he claimed, his tone unapologetic. "This is being blown way out of proportion because he's famous. If he wasn't Shaquille O'Neal, we wouldn't even be here." But his arrogance only further alienated the jury and audience, and the prosecutor skillfully dismantled his arguments, pointing out the clear evidence of his intent to intimidate and humiliate Shaq. As closing arguments were made, the prosecutor emphasized the broader implications of the case. "This isn't just about one man's actions," she said. "This is about holding those in power accountable for abusing that power. It's about saying enough is enough." The defense tried to argue that Barkley's actions were taken in the heat of the moment and that Miller's testimony was unreliable, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict. Sergeant Barkley was found guilty on multiple charges, including destruction of property, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Officer Miller received a reduced sentence of probation in exchange for his cooperation and testimony, but his career in law enforcement was effectively over. The judge commended Marquez for his courage and praised Shaq for using his platform to bring attention to the issue. As the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Shaq hugged Marquez, tears of relief and triumph in his eyes. The boy, who had once been too scared to come forward, now stood as a symbol of bravery and hope. Outside the courthouse, protesters celebrated the victory, chanting for justice and change. Shaq addressed the crowd, his voice filled with emotion. "This isn't just a win for me," he said. "It's a win for everyone who's ever been silenced, for everyone who's ever been told they don't matter. We matter, and today we proved that." The crowd outside the courthouse was alive with energy as Shaquille O'Neal stepped out, his towering frame commanding attention even in the midst of hundreds of supporters. Beside him stood Marquez, clutching a small microphone with a nervous but determined expression. Cameras flashed, and reporters pushed forward to capture every word. Shaq raised a hand to quiet the crowd, his deep voice cutting through the noise as he addressed the gathering. Today, we didn't just win justice for one man. We stood up to a system that has silenced too many voices for too long. This fight isn't over, but this is a step forward. Marquez, emboldened by Shaq's presence, took a step forward to speak. His voice wavered at first, but as he looked at the sea of faces cheering him on, he found his confidence. "I'm just a kid," he said. "I didn't think I could make a difference. But that night, I saw something wrong, and I knew I had to do something. If I can stand up to injustice, so can anyone." The crowd erupted into applause, and Shaq placed a hand on Marquez's shoulder, pride evident in his expression. In the days following the trial, Shaq turned his focus toward creating lasting change. He established the Justice Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal support and resources to victims of police misconduct. The foundation's mission was not only to help individuals seek justice, but also to advocate for systemic reforms in law enforcement practices. Shaq personally reached out to families who had experienced similar injustices, using his platform to amplify their stories and bring attention to their struggles. Marquez became a key part of the foundation, serving as a youth ambassador. With Shaq's mentorship, the boy blossomed into a confident speaker and advocate for change. He often shared his story at events and rallies, inspiring other young people to stand up against injustice. Shaq made sure that Marquez's bravery didn't go unnoticed, awarding him a full scholarship through the foundation to ensure he could pursue his dreams without financial barriers. Meanwhile, the consequences of the trial rippled through the local police department. Investigations revealed a troubling pattern of misconduct among officers, leading to a wave of resignations and firings. The department was forced to implement new training programs focused on accountability and anti-bias practices. Though the changes didn't happen overnight, the trial had set a precedent, showing that abuse of power would no longer go unchallenged. Months later, Shaq and Marquez attended the premiere of a documentary chronicling the events of that night and the subsequent fight for justice. The film, titled Unstoppable Truth, featured interviews with Shaq, Marquez, and other key figures in the case, as well as footage from the protests and courtroom proceedings. As the credits rolled, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Shaq, seated next to Marquez, leaned over and said, "This is just the beginning, kid. We've got a lot more work to do." The final scene of the documentary showed Shaq and Marquez standing outside the charred remains of the SUV that had been set ablaze. The two were silhouetted against the rising sun, a symbol of hope and resilience. Shaq's voice narrated the closing line. The fire they started that night wasn't meant to destroy. It lit a flame in all of us, a flame that will keep burning until justice is not the exception, but the rule. In the years that followed, Shaq's foundation grew into a national movement, and Marquez continued to be a voice for change. Together, they proved that even in the face of hatred and injustice, courage and unity could prevail. Their story inspired countless others to stand up, speak out, and fight for what was right, leaving a legacy that would endure for generations. Thank you for watching this powerful story of resilience and justice. What would you have done in Shaquille's place? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and make a difference. See you in the next video.